I'm Nita Forouhi, the chair for this session. I'm a physician scientist and professor of population health and nutrition at the university's School of Clinical Medicine. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker for today, Layli Miller-Muro, who will explore new perspectives on justice and how we can work boldly to achieve a just and unified society. So a little background about Layli. Layli Miller-Muro is Chief Executive Officer of the Tahirih Justice Center, which provides free legal and social services and engages in advocacy on behalf of immigrant women and girls fleeing human rights abuses. Layli trained in law, and she was an attorney for several years in international litigation, and she was also an attorney advisor at the US Department of Justice Board of Immigration Appeals. Just to re-endorse, this event is part of the Cambridge University Festival, and it's organized today by the Cambridge University Baha'i Society, the founding principles of which include the oneness of humankind, equality between men and women, universal education, the eradication of extremes of poverty and wealth, and the promotion of a just and fair society. At the heart of Baha'i principles is the idea that it is possible to achieve unity through creating societies founded upon cooperation, trust, genuine concern for others, and, most importantly, justice. This is well encapsulated in the following quote: "The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity." And finally, let me just give a couple of housekeeping notices. Firstly, you will notice that there is no chat function in the webinar. We will allow plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. Layli will aim to speak for about 30 minutes. You're welcome to post your questions in the question and answer tab of your screen. At the bottom, you should be able to see it. The questions can be posted with your name or anonymously, but will only be visible to the panel. And to also say, if we have so many questions that we do not have time to cover them all, we will post responses in themes after the event, and I'll go over that information at the end. So for now, really just to say a huge welcome to Layli, and I'll now hand over to you. Thank you, Layli.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm honored to be with you all, and thank you to everyone who is taking time to attend this. I know that many of us feel zoomed out. There are so many video meetings, and so I'm grateful for people who decide to join yet another. We'll be spending our time this evening talking with each other about justice, the importance of justice, the purpose of justice, the mechanisms of justice. And justice is a big deal right now. Justice is a huge topic. We're living at a time of reckoning. We're living in a day of judgment. All of society, all of the world right now is confronting inequity, injustice, and violence in ways that it hasn't before. It's always been there before. That's not an issue, but some of us haven't seen it as clearly as we're seeing it now. We know whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's Me Too and violence against women, whether it's health inequities, economic inequities, all of the things that are happening, particularly in this past year, have helped us appreciate our oneness, our interconnectedness, our dependence on each other, how much in fact we do. Something that happens in one part of the world is going to affect another part of the world. And we're much more connected than I think we were willing to see before. We've always been connected. These issues are not new, but the acuteness of the pandemic and the intensity of the suffering, the fact that we've been all like held up in this cocoon in quarantine or in social distancing has caused a great society-wide reflection and time for really thinking hard about who we are and who we want to be. And then we've, of course, had very pointed moments all over the world. George Floyd's "I can't breathe" words were heard reverberated all throughout the planet, particularly those areas that are white dominated, whether it's Europe, also in Asia, definitely in the United States. And it allowed us to see the lived experience, the real experience that is daily for so many people, that reflects horrible injustice, not only in an immediate sense, but in a structural and an institutional and a long-term sense. And people became very, very disturbed, became perturbed, became awakened, a little bit awakened. And this is great progress. Similarly, when it comes to violence against women, these things are not new. In fact, I was watching, I think it was like the Trevor Noah show. I was watching that the other night, and he was going on with surprise at how women feel unsafe to go out, how women often text their friends and say, let me know when you get home. As a woman, that is my normal. And I was so surprised that for others that was shocking, because for most women, that is the normal, to be afraid every single time you go out, whether it's just because of harassment and inconvenience or because of danger and threats. That is a lived, real experience that is normal, not abnormal. But some men in particular are waking up to the fact that that kind of threat level, that anxiety, that fear is normal. So for many marginalized communities, experiences are now being seen that have not been seen before. And of course, once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. You can become aloof. I mean, you can choose to do nothing about it, but you can't see, you can't say that you have not seen it. So we can't unknow what we know. We can't unsee what we have seen. And it requires action, and it requires responsibility, and that requires justice. And that's what we need in the world. We need justice. It's long overdue. And it's exciting because now we're living in a time where people are calling for justice, people are calling for accountability. But I don't think most of us know what that looks like. I don't think most of us know what is being asked when we say we want accountability for something or we want justice. People conflate that demand with the emotion of revenge, or the emotion of anger, or the emotion of resentment, none of which will lead us to true justice. And so I think that there's something to really reflect on when calls for justice, calls for accountability are being heard, to pause and say, what does that mean? What is the purpose of justice? And what are the mechanisms of justice? So we're going to talk about the purpose of justice, the goals of justice, some of the mechanisms of justice. But first, I want to share with you a little bit more about what I do, what brings me to this topic in particular. It was mentioned in my introduction that I work for an organization called the Tahirih Justice Center. It's a US-based organization that provides free legal defense for women and girls who are fleeing human rights abuses. So our clients are fleeing things like female genital mutilation or cutting, child marriage, domestic violence, human trafficking, all kinds of gender-based violence that have afflicted women in many cultures, under many religions, and many societies for thousands and thousands of years. And what we seek to do is utilize US law as well as advance US law. In recent times, it's been about defending US law in order to use those legal mechanisms in order to protect immigrant and refugee women and girls who have come to the United States seeking protection. At the Tahirih Justice Center, though, we don't define justice as just occurring in the courtroom. The courts provide a role in helping to promote justice, but justice is also about dignity. It's also about rebuilding your own nobility. And so we have social workers on staff who help, they partner with our attorneys and help our clients receive housing, mental health care services, medical services, sometimes job skills training, childcare, but to help them rebuild their nobility in addition to receiving physical safety, and that it's this combination of things that result in justice. So as an organization, we've been around for almost 25 years. We currently have offices in San Francisco, Houston, Texas, Atlanta, Baltimore, and Washington, DC. We have over 100 full-time staff. We're litigating around 3,000 cases at any given time. And we also leverage our resources by working with a small army of about 4,000 volunteer attorneys, pro bono attorneys who work for very large firms, Hewlett Packard, Visa Corporation, Shell Oil, and many, many other large law firms. But these are in-house lawyers who want to feed their soul and who want to do good, and they volunteer with us, as well as from large international corporate law firms who similarly want to volunteer. So that's how we do our work. So I think a lot about justice. I mean, as a lawyer, going through law school, I was taught one version of justice and really thought I understood it. But as I've advanced and progressed in my career, I realize how little, in fact, I know. What's important to know is that our justice system was never meant to be equitable. It was never intended to be just. Back when it was established, and I am being very US-centric in my perspective, because that's the law I work under and the organization that I work for. But I want to acknowledge that our justice system was inherited from the British. And you all are more familiar than I am with the evolution of legal practice, of course. But as we inherited it from Britain, what we inherited was a system that was adversarial. It wasn't really about truth seeking, far less about truth than it is about winning. And the way you win is by hiring the right lawyer to argue your side. Some have said that the jurist, the phrase jurist and jurisprudence comes from jousting. So this idea that usually male, white, rich landowners hire other people to do battle for them. And it's really about who has the biggest stick, whether it's a literal stick or a figurative stick, who has the biggest mouth, who has the biggest words, but it's about who wins. And you hire people to fight that battle for you. And so your ability to receive justice is directly correlated to how much money you have, because it also has to do with your influence, but most importantly, it has to do with the lawyer that you can hire. In particular, in the United States, we have a horrible system which requires to have a lawyer money. And the only ones that get free legal assistance are those who face felony convictions. So these are harsh criminal consequences. They are entitled to a free lawyer to help them, but no one else is. Like in a domestic violence situation, not entitled to a free lawyer. A landlord-tenant dispute, not entitled to a free lawyer. You have to either win the legal aid nonprofit access lottery to get one of the very few lawyers that work for nonprofit organizations, or you have to have money yourself. Throughout Europe, also in the UK, I think there is a better system which has more public lawyers that might be available to people who are poor. But in the United States, we don't have that. So justice is very directly related to how much money you have, or the lottery, whether you're able to win this legal public assistance lottery ticket. And that's not fair. That's not equitable. That's not justice. And it's not about truth. It's about winning over somebody else. And so there's some fundamental flaws in our system that we have to fix. Also, the inception of our justice system was unapologetically, overtly, and transparently racist and sexist. It was always designed initially to protect men, landowners, and those who were white. Now, over the years, we've realized that's not great. We have seen the injustice in that, but it's kind of like we had this house that had a foundation. The concrete was poured to build this house on racism, on sexism, on classism, and all these other kinds of things. And so as we've evolved as a humanity, we've done our best to replace the plumbing, to add updated heating, to add a few annexes here and revisions. We've spackled the cracks on the wall. We've repainted it. We've tried to make it look nice. And we've tried to restructure some pieces of it and to build it. But the problem is that our justice system simply being evolved from a fundamentally flawed system is problematic. And we're seeing that in recent years, I think, even more so. It will take a very radical rebuilding and restructuring of our justice system in order to have true justice. So I want to invite everyone to put in, it has to be in the questions and answers part. But I would like to hear your opinion around why justice matters. Like, so what? Why do you think we need it? And it can be just a word, or it can be a sentence, but I'd love to hear from you. If you could write in the question and answer, I'll be able to see it. And I'll read out some of the answers. You won't see each other's. I'll be able to see it and I'll read out what you're saying, but I would love to hear from you. So what? Why do we need justice? So if you all would please begin to write a few, that would be really, really wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to keep going while people are putting their answers in the question and answers. Why does justice matter? So, you know, all of the world's religions, and it doesn't matter, even if you don't have a religion, but it just so happens all the world religions and really every standard of morality, every ethic that any human has ever had, asks us to treat others as we would want to be treated. This is common. This is a norm. And so it seems as though at least justice should involve us being treated as we would want others to be treated. But the problem is, in order to know how others want to be treated, we have to have empathy for their circumstances. We have to care, first of all. Much of humanity just doesn't care. Then we have to have some proximity, some education, some touch point, and some understanding of the reality of others. And it's a very, very important thing in order to actually care about each other, in order to actually do unto others as we would want to have done unto us, which is a very important part of justice. But the problem is the way justice is often administered is it's with me, myself, and my own selfish interests foremost. And then I don't bother to really understand the needs of others and what justice might look like for them. And as a result, we have a horribly imbalanced system. Okay, so people have given some great, great answers. So I hear accountability, one of the purposes of why does justice matter? Accountability, a common standard for all, instability, empathy, safety, civilization, fairness, kind of reward and punishment, making our limited time on earth together as fair and enjoyable as possible, equity, truthfulness, fairness, equality. Wonderful. I love these answers. So they're beginning to, I'm actually going to read out one more that I like very much, which is injustice hurts us all. So when we kind of say, so why should we care about justice? I think one of the best answers is because if you are experiencing injustice, that should hurt me. This idea that we are one and we're almost like a body. We've got different cellular structures, different nervous system, blood kind of flow structures, and we are this massive organism, and we can't lob off a side of us and be healthy. We have to recognize our interdependence. For the United States, for example, we can't say we don't care what happens to people in Central America. It does affect us. We can't say what happens to a disease in China. It will affect us. We are interdependent, and to believe that we can be isolated, to believe that we can afford to not care about the experience, the injustice, the suffering of other people really only harms ourselves. But we don't have that maturity yet. I think that for most of the world, much of the United States, I'll go ahead and say, there is not that maturity and that recognition of our interdependence and our oneness. So I love these answers. Thank you so much for everybody who contributed. One of the very, very important elements as well of justice, why it's important, is stability of society. Some of you may be familiar with a book by Francis Fukuyama called Trust. And it's all about societies that thrive because there is trust in that society. And they, trust allows people to enter business agreements with each other. It allows for contractual negotiations to happen. It allows for the protection of copyright and property interest. All of the fundamental things that allow us to thrive economically, as well as emotionally and spiritually and educationally, require trust. You got to be able to rely on your educational system. You have to be able to trust that justice will be done if a contract is broken. You have to be able to believe in someone's word if you're about to go into business with them. Without trust, society falls apart. And so we know that justice is the pillar that holds up society. And so, without justice, we don't have trust. And he goes into a lot of detail on that. So justice is important. We can all acknowledge that. And then I also want to ask people, this will be the last thing that I'm going to ask you to put in the Q&A, but just one more question for Q&A. We've talked about why we need justice, but what do you think the end goal of justice is? Like, what is the goal? What's the ultimate purpose of justice? Less why, but what do you hope at the end? Like, what does accountability actually mean? What does justice really look like? What are you looking for at the end of that process? What is its goal? So if you all might provide your answers in the chat, I would be grateful. Oh, great answers. Freedom, progress, peace, united and equal. Great. True equality, a harmonious society, not living in fear, coexistence, having a deterrent for doing wrong, equality, cohesion, peace, unity, progress, happiness, human rights. I don't even know what this word means. Eudaimonia? Eudaimonia? Could someone look that up? For me, I don't know what that means. I'm going to learn something new, I think. Eudaimonia. Happiness, respect, to be acknowledged and reprimanded appropriately, flourishing. Great. These are great, great answers. I love them. They're all great. I'm going to actually distill, I think it's consistent with the answers that everyone gave, which is that the real purpose of justice is unity. That's the end goal. The end goal of justice is so that we can realize our oneness and we can live peacefully with each other and we can have unity. So the problem, though, is, and nobody put this, so you all are way better than our legal system is, because nobody put punishment in here, like that wasn't a word that anyone used. But the way, oh, thank you for the definition, human flourishing. Excellent. Okay. So the way our legal system is set up has the end goal of justice to be punishment. That's the end goal of our legal system. And there is a facade that is justice. And there is a belief by many that is justice. But if unity is the end result of justice, then we have to see justice as a journey towards that unity. Now, consequence, punishment is a piece of that journey. That's the piece of the journey that allows us to not live in fear, right? And it's a lot easier then to forgive someone, to reconcile with someone, to love them unconditionally if you're not feeling physical fear. Now, there are some superhuman people, Gandhi and Martin Luther King and other people who were able to unconditionally love even in the face of injustice, even in the face of violence. And you know, I know some people, mere mortals who still are living on this earth, who also have many of the Tahirih Justice Center's clients exhibit just incredible capacity for forgiveness, incredible capacity for unconditional love. But I think that on the whole, we have a hard time, both in our minds and in our structures in society, holding at the same time justice and forgiveness. And I don't think those things are contrary to each other, in part because I believe that we have different obligations for either. So as a victim of injustice, it's really my job at the end of the day, both emotionally, spiritually, to forgive. I will be at peace if I can forgive. If I have in my mind a high bar idea for what revenge might look like, or restitution, or accountability, I may never be happy, because sometimes those standards are very high when they're rooted in negative emotion. I remember talking to a friend, and it's like, you know, an injustice with a really small I, but she was really angry at somebody who she felt didn't include her enough, had kind of exaggerated, a little bit lied to her, manipulated some situations, spoke badly about her behind her back. So she was very angry at this friend and felt that there had been an injustice, and was just really upset. And I asked her at one point, I said, well, you know, what would justice look like to you? Like at what point, what would make you feel better to allow you to forgive and try to look at her good qualities, to not rely on her for the qualities you know you can't rely on? You know, what would give you peace around that? And she didn't have an answer. She was like, you know, when she said some harsh things actually that were really brutal and not realistic. And I thought, you know, so I think sometimes we have a hard time. If the victim is the one who has to implement justice, that can be really hard. But it's society's obligation to implement justice. And it's our job as bystanders and allies to implement justice. But that should not be on the burden, on the shoulders of the victim. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for someone's mental health. It doesn't work for someone's spiritual health, and it doesn't work in a justice system. So just to give you an example, domestic violence victims in Brazil, and they've made some recent changes to this, but for a very long time in Brazil, the only way a crime of domestic violence could be prosecuted is if the victim herself pursued the case. So she had to be her own prosecutor, essentially. There were legal mechanisms to help her, but it was up to her. And if at any moment, and even if it dragged out for years and years, she decided that she didn't want the pain and the anguish of having to pursue justice, then justice fell away. So it was really up to her. That's a huge burden for a victim to hold. Now, by contrast, in the United States and also in the United Kingdom, the prosecutor does not work for the victim. The prosecutor works for the state. And in fact, what happens is the victim can come to the prosecutor, can go to the state and say, you know what, even though there was all of this physical evidence, I filed an affidavit and gave a witness statement. Even though the police saw exactly what happened to me, I've decided I want to drop the case. I've decided that I forgive him. Now, this happens actually a lot with domestic violence cases because she wants inner peace. She may need to navigate raising children with this man. There are all kinds of reasons why she may want to say something like, can we drop the case? But what happens in the United States and also in the United Kingdom is that the prosecutor works for the state and says, you know what? Nice of you to have forgiven him, but the state has an interest in people not hitting each other. The state will pursue this case, even if you don't want to, because we're not only about the protection of you. We are about the protection of the other women he will meet, of other people in society. Our interest is bigger. It's societal. And it's bigger than one individual. And that works much better. Now, you need the witness to collaborate and to cooperate. It makes it very hard if she becomes difficult or refuses to testify. But the idea is it's not her call. As a victim, she doesn't have to bear the burden of whether he receives punishment. That's on the state. And that kind of segregation of justice, which can allow her to forgive and maybe move on, collaborate with him on how to raise their children together, all of these kinds of things, makes it much more possible. So justice in that context is without emotion. It's without revenge. It's without anger. It's simply a duty. It's an obligation that there be consequence and that person be deterred from ever harming anyone again, and that there be adequate punishment. And then when that happens, hopefully, and this is where also our systems fail, that person can be transformed, rehabilitated, maybe reunite, but be safe around women and other people. And then that arc of reentry into society and the transformation of that person within a context of punishment and reward then allows for us to reunite, to reconcile. But that framework fundamentally assumes all humans are worthy. All humans are noble. All humans have dignity. and deserve an opportunity for redemption and for transformation. And much of our systems don't do that. I mean, in the United States, it's a very throw away the human system. They are often in jail their whole lives, and for a very long time. While they're there are very little efforts made to transform behaviors or beliefs and to help them grow. And as a result, we just harm ourselves. We spend a tremendous amount of money. When people are returned to the streets, they don't have the skills, social or economic skills, in order to survive, and may easily fall back in their ways because that's the only thing they've known. And we fail, ultimately, society and the perpetrators by not seeing them as dignified, not seeing them as redeemable, and not seeing their transformative process, and failing to see that the end result of justice should be unity rather than just punishment. It's also important for all of us to remember that, because whether we're in our work environments, whether we are within our families, in all of these kinds of spaces, whether it's with our children as parents, let us not forget, and let us teach them properly, that the purpose of justice is not punishment. The purpose is ultimate unity. And so, I just to give you an example of this in my work, and then I'll stop talking and I'll open up for questions. We had a client who was facing a child forced marriage. She was a high schooler. She was about 16 years old, very good student, a straight A student. And all of a sudden, her parents let her know that she was to be married to a much older first cousin back in her home country. It was a Middle Eastern country. And when she was told this, she was told she didn't have a choice. This had already been arranged. A dowry had already been paid, and the wedding was being planned. She objected. She cried. She protested. She was beaten as a result of that. Also, her parents decided that it was too risky for her to be in school much or to be around other people. And so they only sent her to school 3 days a week. They would claim that she was sick the other 2 days, but they learned that Child Protective Services would leave them alone if she at least came to school 3 days a week. So they just minimally sent her to school. Her grades began to slip. Her teachers started to notice that she had a very different affect, that she was very sad. Her grades weren't as good as they used to be, and they talked to her. And she opened up to them, and she said, my parents are trying to marry me off, and I don't want to be married. I don't know him. He's much older. It would also mean that I'd be sent back to this country that I don't know, that I've never lived in. And she was very, very upset. The teacher then contacted the principal, who then contacted us. We met with her and explained to her that if she really wanted out, it was a very serious thing. It would mean she would not have access to her family, her own, we explained what was required for her protection. We explained to her that she should pack a bag with all of her necessary and most important documents and clothes and give it to her teacher so that it was safe and with her. That she should carry a spoon with her wherever she went. Because if her parents, on a moment's notice and without any warning to her, took her to the airport to send her abroad, she should say she has to go to the bathroom, and she should put this spoon in her underwear. What will happen then is she goes through security, and security alarm bells would go off. She could then ask the security guard to be privately seen. He would then take her aside, and we could meet her at the airport. So we worked out with her a safety plan. We worked out with her all of these things. She didn't want to leave her family. She was convinced she could convince them. She thought that she could talk sense into them. And she was young, and she also feared for her younger sister. It was a very serious decision. But one night she overheard her mother arguing with her father, who had gone back to the home country, and learned she was, in fact, to be put on a plane that weekend. She had overheard her mother arguing with the father on the phone. So she went to school the next day and said, this is what's happening. We met her at the school. We took her out of school. We immediately took her to court. We got a temporary protective order. She was put with a family to live in safety. And of course, the parents got very upset. They hired a lawyer to argue that their daughter had been wrongfully removed from them. And it was a fight, definitely. After a while, and she went completely underground, social media, everything had to get off. That was really hard for her. But then the family said, we have changed our mind. We're not going to fight this anymore. We're not going to argue this. Come back. We love you. All is forgiven. And they wanted to meet with her. We insisted that they meet in a neutral and in a safe place, and that our lawyer, who speaks fluent Arabic, was able to be present with her as well. And so the meeting went something like, we forgive you. It's totally fine. We love you. Come home. And she didn't believe them. That wasn't realistic. Then they had a second meeting, and the parents in that meeting said, we hate you. You have dishonored us. We have lost a tremendous amount of money off of this. We hope you kill yourself because it would be better if you were dead than if you were to be alive. That was the second meeting. And you can imagine the meetings got honest and got more honest. But then there was this process of understanding and hearing each other. And they came to accept the fact that in the United States, the law would not allow them to do this. After about 7 meetings, the daughter said she did want to go back to her family. Her family said, in truth, they would not force her to marry. The court required that she not be allowed to leave her school. The parents were embarrassed, wanted to move. The judge said, no, all these people know what's going on and they need to have an eye on her. Her passport was confiscated and there was a flag put on it. Her social worker had to meet with her weekly in a safe and independent place in order to make sure she was okay. So there were safety protective boundaries set up. But at the end of the day, she was reunited with her family. And at the end of the day, her family gave up their fight to want to force her to marry somebody against her will. And at the end of the day, her own sister was also protected. That's justice. Had her family just gone to prison, the cultural transformation wouldn't have happened. The behavioral transformation wouldn't have happened, and the unity wouldn't have happened. And so we have to look at justice in a holistic sense. So, I'm going to stop talking, and I do see that there are questions, so happy to answer questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Layli. That was hugely inspiring, and I think you bring with you this deep knowledge and insights from having lived and breathed in this area of work. So we have a number of questions coming in. Please keep posting others. I will read some out just in a second, but I think for me personally, some of the things that really resonated were eye-opening statements and examples that you've given on reimagining what the purpose and the goal and the end goal of justice are, and how really it's based on punishment at the moment, but really it needs to move towards unity. That's what I've taken away. And you illustrated that beautifully. So let me start with some of the questions that we've got. Someone's asking, can you give us, there are 2 things they're asking in this question. One example of how laws in the US favor white people, and one example of favoring men. Because there are lots of people who either don't know or are not convinced that perhaps there are differences by race and gender in justice.
There are so many. It's hard for me to pick one. So I think, I'll just give you one example in asylum law, refugee law. So the area that I work most closely in, the definition of a refugee, it was established by the international community after World War II. The UK has signed on to the exact same legal definition of a refugee that the United States has. So this is a global definition of a refugee. In order to legally prove that you're a refugee, you have to prove several legal elements. You have to prove that you suffer persecution at the hands of the government or by a force that the government cannot or will not control. Then you have to prove that your persecution is on account of or because of one of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. Gender's not there. It was left out completely. The idea that women who suffer gender-based persecution could face persecution and could flee their homeland because of persecution inflicted because they are women, child marriage, female genital mutilation, human trafficking, widespread domestic violence, any number of forms of violence inflicted because they belong to a sex that is viewed as subordinate, viewed as property, viewed as needing to be obedient and compliant, needing to not have sexual pleasure, to make decisions about who they marry, or to be commoditized. It is about the oppression of women, gender-based violence, and it was left out completely of the refugee definition. Now, it's no wonder, I mean, after World War II, there wasn't really a feminist movement that was quite strong. The suffering of women as a right, a form of gender-based violence wasn't commonly seen, but we know better now. And so we have to evolve our law. Now, the UK has retrofitted that refugee definition to include women in a very, it's a very pained, convoluted legal argument that you have to make for women to fit under that definition. In the United States, however, in the last 2 years, gender-based violence has been, to the degree of 90%, eviscerated. So it is no longer possible in the United States to receive asylum or refugee status because of most forms of gender-based violence. And so the law made some advance and then it went backwards. And now we're trying to address that a little bit more. So just one example of how women were completely left out. You know, in terms of whiteness, God, there's so many examples, but I'll use an example that just last week, actually, of some of you, you know, I don't know how global this news is, but Georgia, which is my home state. I was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and I went to college in Atlanta, Georgia. But some of you may know that the election results in Georgia tipped the entire United States. And it was very close, and it tipped the entire United States. Now, what's important to know about that is that all of the political districts have been written and drawn in Georgia by mostly white men in order to maintain their dominance in being reelected and reelected and reelected. And so, but even within that kind of stacked, manipulated framework, this past election, Black people in particular won. And using the rules that had been set up that were already stacked against them, still won. But then what happened just last week is Georgia rewrote the rules because of, they want to make it even harder for Black people to vote. So things like they shortened, made fewer the number of polling stations. They made it illegal to eat food, receive food when you're in line. They're limiting the hours so that working people who don't have a higher income and can't take off work as much aren't going to be able to vote. There were lots of things they did to make voting even more difficult. And it was transparently and directly aimed at the Black community and low income communities, which are disproportionately Black and brown. And so it's a very in your face, overt racist law that was just passed last week. But there are many, many others having to do with finance, housing, having to do with criminality, you know, crack versus cocaine, which are exactly the same biologically and chemically, but crack is more used in the Black community, cocaine more used in the white community. The punishment for crack is like 5 times higher, more jail time than cocaine, which is used by McKinsey consultants and lawyers and doctors. It's like, that makes no sense other than the whiteness of the people who use it. And chemically, it made no sense. We have a lot of laws like that that are not even veiled in their targeting of Black people and brown people.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a number of other questions. I'll try and combine 2 or 3 of them into one theme. So this particular point you raised about the punishment being only part of the overall journey and issue. On that, let me pick up a couple of points. One is that you've played down the importance of punishment, but you have drawn on the vocabulary of rehabilitation. So can you say a little bit about what you understand by rehabilitation and in which places does it take place? The other one, let me just pool it with that, is in terms of justice and unity, How can that be achieved in more extreme cases like murder or terrorism? What does that look like? And a third one is more about solutions of what do you think we can actually do to improve the justice system that will lead towards unity and away from punishment. So these are all picking up on that one theme.
So I'm not going to remember all that. So I tried to write down, but I'll try to go through, and then I may need your help remembering some of the latter questions. So in terms of the role of punishment, punishment consequence has a role to play. Because that's when you realize you can't do what you were doing. It's very clear. But if that is the end, if that's where we stop, then we haven't achieved the goal of justice, which ultimately is living. People had all these wonderful goals of justice, including, and all of them really fit under the ultimate goal of unity and recognizing our oneness. So if we see people as disposable, if we see them as throwawayable, as incarcerated and then done, forgotten, then we are not really achieving justice for society as well as for that person. So was I downplaying punishment? Maybe. I mean, insofar as I think currently punishment is upplayed. Like I think people see it as the end goal and the most important thing. And I would moderate that. I would say that it is a piece of the journey to justice, but it is not the most important element or the only element. But it's an important part of the element. And so, but rooted in the belief that it's not the only part, also has to do with this idea that we believe in the dignity and the nobility of each other, and that we can unconditionally love and forgive. And this also relates to the second question about extreme circumstances, because there are very, you could think things are unforgivable. And this has to do with our own maturity, our own spirit, our own ability. It takes a big person to be able to forgive. And I don't claim to be good at that myself. I don't claim that that is easy for anyone. But I do know that it's possible. And I do know that for true peace and for reconciliation, it's necessary. And it doesn't make it easy, but it makes it really important. And there are many examples. I mean, at the Tahirih Justice Center, our clients have exhibited incredible resilience and ability to forgive. And it's just unbelievable. I think once you're free of the fear, it makes it a lot easier. But many of our clients will talk about how their own, they know that their husband, for example, who was abusive to them, was also abused by his father, that it was the norm in their own culture and their own society, and that there's something we can have sympathy for and understand in that moment. There is a way to have empathy, even for the person who's wronged you. They may be hurt themselves, they may be suffering, they may have not learned better. Or they did know better and they were trained better, and you can still feel sorry for them that they did this horrible, horrible thing, which is reflective of a lower nature, and feel bad for them that they live in that low place, engaging in that kind of abominable behavior. Forgiveness is possible in amazing circumstances. And I would really, really encourage people to learn about Rwanda, really learn about Rwanda. Rwanda experienced, as many of us know, incredible massacres, widespread rape, systematic rape. And what happened after that country experienced the horror of the genocide there is that women took over. And it was partly just because women were most of the ones left. But what happened was a legislature that instituted quotas to maintain and ensure that women would always, in fact, they've been dominant in the legislature, and they have instituted all kinds of justice mechanisms that have consequence. But it's interesting because they, run by women, they decided that one of the most important mechanisms, consequences for justice, was not the incarceration, but was having to face their victim and hear their story. They wanted them to understand what had happened. And somebody mentioned restorative justice, and this is a piece of restorative justice. Really understand what you did, really understand the consequence, hear the pain, hear the suffering. Going to jail, that's easy compared. Really understand, and then rectify it, beg for forgiveness, compensate, do things that help restore and help really change things for that person. And that's true justice. They implemented and I'm doing a horrible injustice in my explanation, but I would really encourage you to learn about Rwanda and kind of the systematic forgiveness on some of the most abominable, horrific, unforgivable behavior humans are capable of. And they were able to do this because they know that they needed to heal the country. And they've also rebuilt in incredible ways. I mean, some of you may remember that when, for a brief period of time, Europe reopened to the world with COVID, it listed like just a few countries that could travel, not including the United States for totally understandable reasons, but including Rwanda. And a lot of people saw that and were like, what? You know, it included all these advanced countries and then Rwanda. Rwanda has redesigned its health system in collaboration with a team at Harvard. They're like progressive. They're amazing. They're an incredible country that has rebuilt itself. But they did that because they had a system of justice that was not only about consequence, but was also about healing. We have a lot to learn. And I dare say that whiteness, culturally, whiteness doesn't love forgiveness. There are I lived in West Africa for a period of time, and I saw that there was a propensity and a willingness to forgive in a way that my own cultural narrative found foreign. I came from a culture background, given my whiteness, that felt good holding a grudge, that felt that it was justice to have someone punished and kind of view them as disposable. That is one culture. It doesn't need to be the dominant cultural approach to justice. And I hope it won't be for long.
Okay, that's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you. So, Layli, another question that's come in is what sorts of experiences have you had in terms of persuading the US courts of law to understand or accept your views of justice that you put forward that, you know, goes beyond the more conventional definitions?
Yeah, there are a lot of movements afoot to try to transform. It does depend, unfortunately, on politics. You know, what laws are passed and who are appointed as judges. So it's a very long road. I do think that the recognition of some of the inequities that we've really seen in recent years have awakened people and made them more open to more radical versions of justice and different notions of justice. But it's a really long haul. I mean, at the Tahirih Justice Center, we're engaged in 42 federal lawsuits in order to try to defend what due process should be, what justice should be. For example, we're arguing that it is not justice to put children and mothers in jail when what they have done is avail themselves of asylum law, which allows you, in fact, to cross the border illegally, so long as when you get to the other side, it's true that you were fleeing violence. And if you can prove that, it's kind of like maybe a jaywalking law that says, you know, normally you have to cross only at the crosswalk, but if you're fleeing a burning building, you can run across the street. Now, we might arrest you on the other side because all we've seen is you run in the middle of the street. But if you can prove to us on the other side that you were fleeing a burning building, then we'll understand why you had to run in the middle of the street. It's our border is the same way. And putting people in incarceration, in jail, for simply availing themselves of the law is not justice, but an injustice. And we're litigating cases to argue that. Also the fact that they pay the women in those jails, immigrant women, $1 a day to do all the cleaning and the cooking. We're arguing that's human trafficking. There's an industrial complex for the private companies that are running those prisons. Anyway, I mean, these are some examples, but there are many more.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, do you think that organizations like United Nations Women and the ways they tackle injustice are effective?
You know, I don't claim to know enough about the way they are tackling injustice to be able to answer that. So I'm not sure I'm able to critique that.
That's fine. We can skip that. And if you want to think about it and give I will reiterate now, we will not get through all the questions because there are many more still remaining. We will put some responses in themes through our Facebook page, which I will tell you more about in a bit to the audience. Okay, so someone's asking, do you think capitalism and justice can coincide?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that part of what justice is, though, is helping to moderate selfish impulses, greedy impulses, dominant impulses. And so justice, I would say, is even more necessary in a capitalist system. But, I also just don't think capitalism is going away. And I don't think there's any pure form of capitalism. Just like there's definitely no pure form of communism. All of these labels that we've ascribed to different systems, I think in the last 30 years in particular, have proven meaningless. I think those of us who grew up in the 70s and the 80s think more categorically about things like communism and capitalism and that kind of thing. But now we know none of it's true. I mean, there's no capitalist system that doesn't have regulation, that doesn't have elements of socialist design. And then you look at China and you know that there's no communist system that has no elements of capitalism and these kinds of things. So I don't love labels to begin with, but I don't think they work in society anymore. But if what you mean by capitalism is profit, people will make profit, they will have ownership, and they will make profit. I think that is an inevitability, and it helps with intrinsic motivation, and there are things about that can work well for innovation and productivity. But then what we need layered on top of that are laws and regulations that manage the boundaries of how people behave within that system. And that's what we need more strongly and more consistently. So yes, I think justice is possible.
Absolutely. Okay, so one last question, and we will park the other questions. There are some more, but the last one I'll ask you now is, someone's asking, would having more women, Black people, people of different religions, etc., in the justice, in law, improve the justice system?
Yes, absolutely, without hesitation. But there has to be a lot of them. And what I mean by that is we know that tokenizing, having, so I'll just give you an example. My old law firm had, 2,000 attorneys. It was a very large international corporate law firm, and only 5% of their partners were women. Now, that small of a percentage means that the women who had to operate within that system basically had to operate like men. Like there weren't enough of them to really shift culture, to really influence a shift and a change. And in fact, there have been studies on that it's about a third. A third is when you can engage in cultural shift. So it is not enough to say in an organization of 200, look, we have 2 Black people. Look, we have 5 women. It's not enough to say that, because if those are your percentages, then those people have accommodated and acculturated to the dominant culture. Right. So what you really need is about a third to begin to influence in the other direction and make a meaningful change.
Well, there's a target for all of us to think about, not only in the
third isn't enough. I should say 50% at least, whatever the representative proportion is, but yes.
Yes, but I think as a rough guide, and I think it applies broadly in other fields too, like in higher education, where we are in universities. We're all working towards a better workplace culture, and I think it applies there too. So it now comes to me to thank you very much, Layli, for such a fantastic session, very thought-provoking. And I think just the sheer number of questions that have come in is also indicative of how much the audience have enjoyed that and have engaged with you. So thank you. And I think if we were in a real room, we'd be giving you a loud applause right now, but please consider yourself applauded, and thank you. So now I'd like to just go over some housekeeping at the end. Firstly, thank you to our audience for being so patient and for being with us this evening. We've enjoyed your company, even though we can't see you. So could we please have the slide up for where we will post the responses? Okay, so firstly, for the questions that have not been answered, or for any in the audience who want to go through a more interactive session where we can explore some of these points, not only from this talk tonight, but we've had two other talks earlier in the Cambridge University Festival on COVID and post-COVID recovery and global economics, and also on the individual and social change. So if you want to explore any of those topics, we have a session this Friday. I know it's Good Friday, and not all of you or many of you will be able to make it, but we have put on a session and you're welcome to attend that. That's the interactive session. And the other thing to say is that those questions we have not answered, just to reiterate, we will post some responses and themes through our Facebook page. There is this QR code and also the Facebook page of the Cambridge University Baha'i Society where you can access these. So these were just a couple of announcements I wanted to make. And with this, thank you all for being here. Thank you to Layli, and thank you to Cambridge University Festival for giving us this opportunity to arrange these three talks from the Cambridge University Baha'i Society. Thank you and bye-bye.